"Yo, look at this guy," one of the athletes whispered, his voice cutting through the cabin as passengers shuffled to their seats. His words weren't subtle. They were sharp, pointed, and dripping with amusement. Another player leaned in, eyes fixed on the tall black man who had just slid quietly into his seat. "Man looks like he came straight from the Greyhound. Bet he ain't ever sat in business class in his life." Laughter burst out between them, the kind that wasn't just cruel, it was meant to sting. Heads turned, a few passengers frowned, but no one said a word. The plane was filling fast, the hum of chatter blending with the athlete's mockery. The man didn't respond. He simply adjusted the strap of his worn hoodie, placed a leather bag under the seat, and leaned back against the headrest. His eyes turned toward the window, fixed on the blinking runway lights. His silence was steady, almost unnervingly so. The lack of reaction fueled the boys. One nudged another, smirking. "Hey, big guy," he called out, louder now. "You working the baggage crew when we land, or what?" Their laughter spilled down the aisle, thick and obnoxious. A flight attendant glanced their way, her brow tightening. For a brief moment, the players quieted. But as soon as she moved on, the snickers resumed, this time bolder, edged with arrogance. Their crisp team jackets and matching sneakers made it clear who they thought they were. Stars in the making, untouchable. Yet their target didn't so much as blink. His stillness was unsettling, like a mountain unmoved by wind. The boys mistook it for weakness, but those who watched closely might have sensed something else, an aura of patience, control, and quiet strength. The rest of the cabin felt the tension like static in the air. A mother tightened her grip on her child's hand. A businessman lowered his paper, shaking his head. Still, no one spoke. "Up." The laughter echoed, bouncing off the narrow walls of the plane. But the man sat unbothered, as though he had endured far worse in his life than the empty words of arrogant boys. His silence was not submission. It was power contained, waiting. Engines roared as the plane prepared for takeoff, the vibrations rattling through the cabin. The athletes, cocky grins plastered on their faces, leaned back in their seats. To them, the moment was nothing but another joke, another laugh at someone else's expense. What they didn't know was that their laughter had an expiration date. Because the man they mocked was not a stranger. He was their future. And when the truth revealed itself, every smirk would vanish. The plane rose into the night sky, carrying with it not just passengers, but a storm of lessons waiting to break. "Man, look at him just sitting there," one of the athletes muttered, shaking his head as though the sight alone was a punchline. Another leaned forward, voice low but sharp enough to cut through the hum of the cabin. "Bet he doesn't even know what a real game looks like. Probably washed up if he ever played at all." Their words came in waves, snickers, whispered insults, and the occasional burst of laughter that made nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. The group's arrogance filled the aisle like smoke, thick and choking. Yet the man at the center of it all remained unmoved. He didn't turn his head. He didn't defend himself. His eyes stayed fixed on the faint reflection in the window, as though he was watching something far beyond the runway lights, something no one else could see. That silence. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't fear. It was composure, the kind that unsettled anyone paying close attention. A teenage boy seated 2 rows up leaned toward his mother. "Why don't they leave him alone?" he whispered. She gave a small shake of her head, pulling him back into his seat, unwilling to make the situation worse. The athletes, however, mistook the man's quiet for surrender. One of them chuckled under his breath. "See? Nothing to say. Knew it." Another added with a smirk. "People like that don't get it. They're just invisible." But while their words stung the ears of those around them, the man's face didn't change. If anything, There was a flicker of something in his expression, something unreadable. A hint of patience? A trace of knowing? Passengers began trading glances. Some looked at the athletes with thinly veiled disapproval, others at the man with a kind of curiosity. Who was he really? Why didn't he bite back? There was a mystery in his restraint, a quiet dignity that seemed out of place in the confined chaos of a plane cabin. And though the athletes couldn't see it, everyone else could feel it. Because silence has a way of speaking louder than laughter. And soon, that silence would echo back at those boys in a way they could never have predicted. As the plane soared higher into the night sky, the tension inside the cabin grew heavier, setting the stage for truths yet to be revealed. His eyes, fixed on the dark window of the plane, didn't just see the clouds outside. They drifted inward, back to a different time, a different world. The laughter of the athletes faded, replaced in his memory by the sound of sneakers on cracked asphalt. A much younger version of himself stood on a weather-worn basketball court, the only black kid in a neighborhood where the game wasn't just about skill, it was about proving you even belonged. "Ball's not for you, boy," a voice had once sneered, shoving him hard as he tried to join the pickup game. He remembered the sting of the dirt, the sting of the words, but he also remembered the fire it lit inside him. Night after night, he stayed on that same court, shooting until the streetlights buzzed out, running drills while other kids went home to dinner. His mother would call out from the porch, "Come inside, son. Don't wear yourself. Down." And he'd answer with nothing but another shot, another push-up, another sprint. Years passed. He made it onto school teams, always the outsider, always underestimated. Coaches doubted him, teammates mocked him, but each insult became fuel, each doubt carved his focus sharper. In college, it wasn't just about playing anymore, it was about survival. He endured racist jeers from the stands, whispers in locker rooms, even professors who assumed he'd fail. But he didn't quit. He studied harder, trained longer, and carried himself with a pride they couldn't break. "Remember," his old mentor had once told him, gripping his shoulder firmly, "respect isn't given, it's earned. And when you earn it, no man can take it away." That lesson stayed with him, through torn ligaments that nearly ended his career, through the pain of being overlooked for opportunities he had fought for, through the bitter nights when giving up would have been easier than carrying on. But he never gave up. And little by little the world began to notice. His leadership shined brighter than his stats. His discipline became a beacon for others. He rose not just as a player, but as a guide, a strategist, a man whose presence demanded respect without ever raising his voice. Now, seated quietly on that plane, he carried every scar, every victory, every lesson within him. To the athletes mocking him, he looked like just another man. But to those who truly saw, he was something far greater. Because strength isn't built in the spotlight, it's forged in the shadows, through pain, rejection, and resilience. And soon, those boys would learn that the man they ridiculed had already walked through fires they couldn't imagine, and come out unburned. The cabin lights flickered softly, pulling him back to the present, where whispers still lingered. But the next chapter of this story, his story, was about to be... "Did you? Man, this season's already ours," one of the athletes bragged, leaning back in his seat as if he was sitting on a throne instead of a cramped airplane chair. His voice carried, bold and unapologetic. Another chimed in, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Please, nobody's touching us. Those other teams don't even belong on the same court. We'll crush them by halftime." The group erupted in laughter, not the nervous kind from before, but the cocky laughter of boys who believed the world bent to their talent. Their jackets flashed their team logo proudly, as if stitched into destiny itself. They compared stats, boasted about their latest wins, and mocked rival players they'd soon face. "That guard from Eastwood? Trash. Couldn't even guard me in practice," Another added, "And don't even get me started on Northfield. Their coach is ancient. Dude couldn't inspire a goldfish to swim." Every word dripped with arrogance. Their voices grew louder, overlapping each other, filling the cabin like a victory parade before the battle had even begun. Meanwhile, the man they had ridiculed sat in silence only a few rows away, still staring out the window. To them, he was invisible. Just another face in the crowd. But the irony was sharp. They spoke of coaches being weak, leaders being outdated, never realizing the very leader they would soon depend on was right there, listening. Passengers exchanged glances again, some shaking their heads, others rolling their eyes at the bravado. The athletes didn't care. In their minds, they were already champions. But champions aren't made from words. They're made from lessons, and these boys hadn't learned theirs yet. As the plane cut through the night sky, their laughter rang louder than the engines. But soon, it would be silenced by a truth they weren't ready to face. The wheels screeched against the runway, jolting the cabin as the plane touched down. The athletes cheered like they'd already won a championship, clapping each other on the shoulders and talking over the flight attendants' instructions. Their voices carried into the narrow aisle, dripping with excitement and bravado. "Finally," one of them said, stretching his arms wide. "Time to meet the new coach. Hope he can keep up with us." Another laughed. "He better not be soft. We need someone who knows how to handle winners." Their swagger followed them off the plane. They moved through the airport terminal like a pack, loud and careless, their jokes bouncing off the polished floors. Passengers gave them space, some out of courtesy, others out of annoyance. They didn't notice. To them, the world was their stage. And then, everything shifted. Standing near the baggage claim was a line of staff members dressed in the team's colors. They weren't waiting for the players. Their attention was locked on someone else. The man in the grey hoodie. The same man the athletes had mocked, insulted, and dismissed just hours earlier. He stepped forward, calm and steady, the same quiet strength in his stride. And as he approached, the staff greeted him with handshakes, nods of respect, even admiration. "Coach," one of them said warmly, "we're glad you're here." The word hung in the air like thunder. "Coach." The athletes froze mid-laugh. Their smiles collapsed, their voices caught in their throats. One of them muttered under his breath, "Wait, that's him?" Another whispered, "No way. That can't be." But it was. The man they had ridiculed was not a stranger. He was their new leader, their mentor, the one who would decide if they played or sat on the bench. The weight of realization hit them harder than any opponent ever had. Every joke, every sneer, every insult, they all replayed in their minds, burning with shame. The man they had laughed at now held their future in his hands. And the coach? He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply glanced at them, his expression unreadable. A silence, thicker than... The airport air fell between them, a silence that said more than words ever could. The athletes shifted awkwardly, their once confident swagger reduced to nervous fidgets. For the first time, they weren't the ones in control. Because now, respect wasn't optional. It was required. And as the coach walked ahead, leading the way out of the terminal, the players followed, quiet, humbled, and uncertain of what awaited them next. The laughter that once filled the airport terminal had vanished, snuffed out like a candle in the wind. Where there had been noise and bravado, now there was only silence. A silence so heavy it pressed down on the group of athletes like a weight they couldn't shake off. Their new coach, the very man they had mocked, walked ahead with quiet authority, his presence commanding without effort. The staff trailed behind him with respect, their voices hushed. But the players, they could barely lift their eyes from the polished floor. "Man, "We really messed up," one of them whispered under his breath, though even that sounded too loud in the suffocating quiet. They replayed every word they had thrown his way on the plane, every smirk, every insult, every burst of cruel laughter. Now those moments weren't funny anymore. They were anchors dragging their confidence into the ground. One boy tugged at his jacket collar, suddenly aware of how foolish it looked draped over his chest. Another shoved his hands deep into his pockets, chewing at his lip. Their bravado, their proud, untouchable swagger, had evaporated. In its place was unease, awkwardness, and shame. The irony stung. Hours ago they had been kings of the sky, mocking a stranger they thought was beneath them. Now that stranger was the man who held their futures in his hands. Their minutes on the court, their spots on the roster, even their shot at glory. It all ran through him. And the worst part? He hadn't said a single word. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any lecture could ever be. His calm composure made their embarrassment sharper, cutting deeper, with every step they took behind him. The team exchanged nervous glances, but found no comfort in each other. No one dared crack a joke. No one dared break the silence. For the first time, they weren't the loudest voices in the room. And in that silence, a new kind of respect began to take root. As the team followed their coach out of the terminal, heads low and egos shattered, they had no idea what he would say to them next. But whatever it was, they knew one thing for certain. They would listen. The locker room was quiet. Too quiet for a group of athletes who had once been loud enough to drown out the roar of an engine. Their eyes darted nervously from wall to floor, avoiding the man who now stood before them. Not as a stranger, but as their coach. He didn't pace. He didn't shout. He simply stood with his hands folded calmly, waiting until the weight of silence settled so deeply that it demanded someone break it. And then, with a steady voice, he did. "You think talent makes you great?" he asked, his tone even, deliberate. "You think skill alone puts you above the rest?" No one answered. Their earlier arrogance had dissolved into unease. He looked at each of them, not with anger, but with piercing clarity. Talent fades. Crowds stop cheering. Records get broken. But character is what lasts. His words echoed in the room, stronger than any raised voice could have been. One of the players shifted in his chair, mumbling, "Coach, we didn't know." The man cut him off gently, but firmly. "That's the problem. You didn't want to know. You judged before you looked. You laughed before you listened." He let the words hang, and the truth in them sank deep. He stepped closer, his presence commanding without force. Respect isn't earned by trophies. Respect is earned by how you treat people, when the cameras aren't on, when no one is watching. The athletes sat, frozen, shame still raw on their faces, but beneath it something else stirred, recognition. "You want to be champions?" he asked. "Then start by being men of integrity, discipline, humility, because without those, winning means nothing." His voice softened, but his gaze remained unflinching. "I've been where you are. I know what arrogance does. It destroys teams. It destroys futures. But humility? That builds. That unites. That carries you further than talent ever could." For the first time since boarding the plane, the athletes didn't see a man to mock. They saw a leader. Someone who had walked a path they couldn't yet understand. Someone who had chosen not to break them with anger, but to shape them with wisdom. The room was silent again. But this time it wasn't shame holding their tongues. It was respect. And as the coach's words lingered in the air, the players knew the season ahead would not just test their skills, but their character. And that test was only beginning. The squeak of sneakers echoed across the hard wood. Sweat dripped, muscles ached. Voices that once mocked now grunted in exhaustion as the coach pushed them harder than they had ever been pushed before. "Again," he barked. His voice wasn't angry, but sharp, deliberate. "Run it back. No shortcuts." The athletes groaned but obeyed. Sprint after sprint, drill after drill, their arrogance melted away under the weight of discipline. No one dared laugh now. No one dared complain. Every mistake was met not with ridicule from their teammates, but with correction. For the first time, they weren't just playing for themselves. They were playing for each other. One practice blurred into the next. Early mornings, late nights, endless repetition. The same boys who once sneered at humility were now learning it with every drop of sweat that hit the floor. "Pass it earlier," the coach shouted during a scrimmage. "It's not about you, it's about the team." The player adjusted. And when the ball moved faster, when it reached the open man for an easy shot, something clicked. They weren't just teammates anymore. They were beginning to trust. The coach's lessons echoed off the court and into their lives. Respect in the locker room grew. Jokes turned from mockery to encouragement. Instead of rolling their eyes, they listened. Instead of bragging, they worked. One afternoon, after a grueling session, the players sat slumped on the bench, gasping for air. The once cocky leader of the group glanced at his coach and murmured, "Coach, we needed this. I needed this." The coach gave a small nod, saying nothing more than, "Then prove it." And they did. Game by game, practice by practice, the transformation was undeniable. The same team that had walked through an airport dripping with arrogance was now carrying themselves with unity, discipline, and quiet confidence. The laughter that once filled the air wasn't gone. It had changed. Now, it wasn't cruel or mocking. It was light-hearted, joyful, the sound of young men finally understanding what it meant to play with purpose. And as their bond grew stronger, so did their game, setting the stage for a championship moment that would test everything they had learned. The roar of the crowd was deafening. Bright lights blazed overhead, banners waved in the air, and the court gleamed like a battlefield waiting for its warriors. This wasn't just another game. This was the championship. The stage where legacies were written. The athletes huddled together, no longer the cocky boys who once filled a plane with laughter, but a team forged by sweat, discipline, and humility. Their coach stood before them, steady and unshaken, his calm voice cutting through the chaos outside. "Remember," he said, his eyes locking with each of theirs, "talent may win a game, but character wins championships." The whistle blew. The game began. From the opening tip, their opponents came hard, fast breaks, sharp passes, suffocating defense. The boys stumbled, at first nearly slipping back into old habits. One tried to force a shot, another hesitated under pressure. The other team capitalized, running up the score. But then came the reminder, a voice from the sideline, calm yet firm. "Trust each other." And they did. The ball began to move differently. Crisp passes, extra effort on defense. No one hunting for glory, only opportunities for the team. A player who once bragged about never passing now dished out an assist that electrified the crowd. Another who used to hog the spotlight dove to the floor for a loose ball, drawing cheers from the stands. Slowly, the tide turned. The scoreboard ticked closer. Every possession was a war. The other team fought back hard, but these boys had something new, something deeper. They had unity. With seconds left on the clock, the score was tied. The arena held its breath. The ball found its way into the hands of the team captain, the same young man who once mocked his coach the loudest. He glanced toward the basket, ready to take the shot. But then he remembered the lesson. It's not about me. It's about us. At the last moment, he passed to his teammate in the corner. Wide open. Perfect shot. The ball arced through the air, spinning, gliding, until it snapped through the net. The buzzer blared. The crowd erupted. Victory. The players leapt into each other's arms, not as individuals but as brothers. Tears mixed with laughter, joy mixed with relief. And as the noise thundered around them, their eyes turned to the man on the sideline. Their coach. He didn't cheer. He didn't boast. He simply gave a small, proud nod. Because this win wasn't about the scoreboard. It was about the transformation. And as the team lifted the trophy, they knew the season had given them more than a championship. It had given them a mentor, and a lesson they would carry long after the final whistle. The championship trophy gleamed under the stadium lights, heavy in the players' hands but weightless in their hearts. They had won. But as the cheers faded and the confetti settled, something far more important lingered than the victory itself. The team gathered in the quiet of the locker room, their jerseys soaked with sweat, their faces flushed with triumph. Yet they weren't laughing arrogantly as they once did. Instead, they sat in silence, listening, waiting for the man who had changed everything to speak. The coach stood at the front, his expression calm, his eyes steady. He didn't need to shout to be heard. His presence was enough. "You played with heart tonight," he began, his voice even but carrying a weight that drew every ear. "But more than that, you played with respect. You played with humility. And that's why you stand here as champions." The boys exchanged glances, their earlier shame replaced now with pride. Not in themselves, but in the growth they had found together. The coach paused, then added quietly, "I know who you were when we first met. I remember the laughter, the judgments, the arrogance." He let the words hang in the air, but his gaze softened. "And I also see who you are now. That's the victory that matters most." One of the players finally spoke, his voice low but sincere. "Coach, we were wrong about you. About everything. Thank you for not giving up on us." The coach nodded slowly, a faint smile at the corner of his lips. Never judge a man by his clothes, his silence, or his seat on a plane. True strength doesn't shout, it endures. True wisdom doesn't demand, it guides. And true respect is earned both ways. The room was still, the weight of his words sinking deep into the hearts of young men who would never see the world the same way again. These weren't the same boys who once mocked a stranger. These were young men forged by discipline, humility, and the steady hand of a leader who had walked through fire long before they ever laced up their shoes. The coach looked around the room one last time. "Remember this. Championship. IPS fade. Trophies collect dust. But character, that lasts. Carry it beyond this game. Carry it into life." The players nodded, some with tears they tried to hide, others with faces hard as stone, but eyes shining with newfound respect. As they left the locker room, they no longer walked with arrogance. They walked with purpose. Side by side, united, their admiration for their coach clear in every step. And the man they had once laughed at? He didn't need to remind them who he was anymore. His lessons had spoken louder than any insult ever could. Because greatness isn't about how the world sees you in a moment. It's about who you choose to become when no one is watching. And that, above all, was the moral they would carry for the rest of their lives.